channel is to engage in collaborative exploration of economic systems and the tools necessary for regenerative humanity. And today, the objective is to talk about tipping points, as presented last week at this conference of tipping points on tipping points. And there were a variety of sessions. The one that we're going to focus on is primarily this first one, kind of defining a little bit what it is that they meant and how they understood it, our takeaways and positive and negative forms, and then open up the discussion. We will have as a focus, and I'll get to this as kind of the eventual question, their hypothesis is that one of the ways in which groups can make a bigger difference is they were wanting to focus on the relationship between cities and their place, the bioregions or the watersheds that they were in. So as we go through this conversation, that's going to be one of the prompts to hold in the back of your mind about how might we as individuals be using this to influence our local place and in turn ripple forward to the larger place. So why tipping points? Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, who basically won the prize for self-assembly that happens out of chaos into order, talked about how when a system is in a chaotic state, far from equilibrium, small islands of order, small islands of coherence have the capacity to shift the entire system into order. And so what started as a insight from chemistry turns out to be a systems principle that applies over and over and over. And so in this conference, it was explored primarily through ecological systems as well as through social systems. And as many of us who are in the ecological spaces know, about 50 years ago, there was a major study on limits to growth that we were past the carrying capacity of the planet for the population that is in place, and that we were possibly going to induce both social and ecological collapse. What you see on the right-hand side of the diagram was this study showed 4 different scenarios starting in 1972 that had business as usual, worse than usual, and 4 kind of adaptive, positive adaptive. And for the most part, collapse would be between now and 2030, and it would, if we followed with business as usual, and yeah, I'll just stop there. So how are we doing presently? Starting in 1972, apparently Christmas of 1972 was the day that we officially started going over planetary capacity, and we've been over it ever since. And there's this Global Overshoot Day, which is a way of marking globally what day do we overshoot the carrying capacity on any given year of the planetary resources. So this year, I believe it was August 1st, we crossed into overshoot, and so that amounts to 1.7 amounts of what the Earth is producing each year. Presently is what we're consuming. And so at the rate we're going, even if we correct, we can both correct our current rate, and then we have to catch up for 50 years of kind of overshoot. So so the problem is dire. And many of us know this particular way of representing the 9 measured planetary boundaries, and that of those 9, since they've started to be measured, we've transcended 6. Now, in social tipping points, one of the things that we found interesting, some of us, was that there's this whole kind of, at what point are you kind of, it may happen, and then all of a sudden it cascades into an adopted, widely adopted practice or widely adopted. When does the tipping point happen in social systems? And research into this seems to suggest that after a quarter of people adopting a social norm, for example, you begin to have the likelihood of it becoming a tipping point. And by the time it reaches 31% or a third, you accelerate the adoption of the new behavior at its fastest rate. There were some conversations. Any questions so far? Or just keep going? This is about the halfway point of the talking part, so maybe I'll just finish it off and be done. Was how the properties of a network affect both the spread of information and how the spread of information is not the same as the spread of persuasion, which of course is what most of us think we're doing when we're sharing information. So this first diagram represents a network where everybody's connected well to each other. And so it is the kind of network where behavior spread happens most quickly and most readily. Then in separated clusters of social networks, the second diagram shows the fastest way to share information. However, as kind of suggested, spreading information and spreading behavior, spreading persuasion are very different things, and that you must have a certain degree of redundancy, if you will, so that people see evidence of multiple other actors modeling the behavior from a diversity of lenses. They're not just getting it all from one person, but they're seeing everybody's wearing blue these days. It's not just one person, that kind of thing. And so it's important to think about the structure of the social network and how it's being optimized in order to support the diffusion of ideas. Tanuja, do you want to talk about this negative example, or shall I?
Please, you go, and then we can speak
Okay.
as a panel later.
So we'll talk about two examples, one from the conference, the other one, yeah. So this one talks about how an ecological and a political series of vulnerabilities can kind of conflate into a blow up. And this had to do with water, the depletion of the water table in Syria, and not just Syria, it's really the Mesopotamian water basin, really. The Euphrates and Tigris are being overconsumed, and this is leading to problems, particularly in years of drought, and whether it is scarcity of food, conflicts, that a lot of the symptoms of ecological scarcity show up socially and are explained through different language, but that they become tipping points, each compounding the other, that the use of water leads to needing to use more water, conflict leads to more conflict, and it just becomes a vicious spiral. This diagram was a methodological one about the relationship between different layers, if you will, of scale, whether it was the individual, the family, different levels of network, and to basically consider, okay, what is in, I use the word Dunbar. The Dunbar number is the number of relationships, presumably, that you can have in your life. Who is in your Dunbar network? Who is connected to that Dunbar network? And how can these things ripple from one's life further out? And this example is not from the conference, but I find it to be useful as a positive example of social diffusion. And what it is after the Vietnamese War, an American scientist was working in Vietnam, and the American government was no longer there to fund big projects the way that normally interventions in child malnutrition would happen. And he was sitting there thinking, okay, I'm an American after the Vietnamese War. How do I make a difference? And what he did was he went hunting for positive deviance. What is an example of mothers whose children are not dying? And from 100 mothers, he didn't do this in the capital. He moved out of the capital to the local villages where most of the deaths were happening. And, from 100 mothers realized, okay, about 50 of these have a rich uncle in the city who's sending money. That's not something we can replicate. But of the other 50 mothers, we still have something that these mothers are experiencing, that is, their children are not dying at the same rate as the average family. So what are they doing differently? And they found out, they had Vietnamese observers look at what they were doing, and they noticed three things that were culturally different from the Vietnamese norms. One, instead of eating twice a day, they were eating 4 times a day. That they were feeding the children 4 times a day. That allowed the children to absorb more nutrients instead of the 2 meals that adults had. Second, they were including potato peelings and the peelings from the turnips and stuff like that into the food that was actually social low status, but turns out to be high nutrition, where all the nutrition actually is. So that was also helping with the extra nutrition. And third, from the patties and such, they were collecting crabs and insects and adding extra protein. And that those 3 things turned out to make a difference between who was having kids that lived to the age of 5 and who had kids that died before the age of 5. And so it's like, okay, now we know what an important difference is. How can we make this socially contagious? Can we create a tipping point around this? And what they did is they first tried, okay, having Vietnamese mothers teach other Vietnamese mothers, because given that some of these behaviors are low status behaviors, it was like, maybe they will, maybe they won't do this, because we don't always do if something is low status. But they found out that it could be transmitted. And once it was transmitted, that's when they started engaging local town councils and provincial authorities to then scale the process in town after town after town. And that is when this process became nationwide and actually lowered the case of child malnutrition. So that's a complete walkthrough, a positive deviance case. But again, it's to stimulate our thinking about what are positive examples that we may know about or we witness, and how do we help grow these in the regenerative space. So the idea that fractals, that our fractals can infect other, I can infect another person, and that, like disease, positive behavior can replicate wildly, is something that is understood much better than ever was previously. With that, now landing back on the question, if we are seeking to influence the systems that we're in towards regeneration, what kind of actions can we take to cultivate regenerative resilience? And again, we might go in 20 different directions as a network that we are, or as individuals, but as a provocation, we're putting out, how can we support the city to bioregional action? So with that,
Michael, don't take the slides down, please. Love that little provocation there. GRC to what? So David Witzel, that's a call to action for you.
No, it's not. David Witzel is not GRC.
Okay, we are GRC. Could we, Michael, do you mind going back to that slide with 2 circles? The one about this one, yes. Would you speak a little bit to the circles on the left? Because I think it'd be quite illuminating it's hard to read, from where we are.
Sorry.
And what the numbers, what's happening, the inner circle is 10 to the power 0, meaning 1, and 10 to the power 1, 10 to the power 2, and so on. So it's each circle is a scale up by a factor of 10. So it's an analytical understanding of scaling in nature and social systems. So if you could speak to that a bit.
So although this uses decimal scaling, my own hypothesis is the Dunbar number. The Dunbar number presumes that, and it's an invented number, we're not sure how science grounded it is, but it's got some strength to it, is there's 150 to 250 people that over the course of your life, you have significant relationships and that you have the bandwidth for, and that you maintain. And there's a question of whether or not we're stretched beyond our Dunbar number or what, but this model is this idea that it's like, okay, of my strongest ties and relationships, let's say my family, that's a cluster. And it's a way of it's a categorization scheme of different layers of social clustering, you could say, factored in tens to show larger and larger scale. But as I say, I think when you actually use the number of 150 or 250, you get closer to what in Hollywood is called the Kevin Bacon degree. In other words, that we may be connected to anybody in the world by only 6 degrees of separation. So that even though this represents 10 levels, that our influence is actually much higher. But again, each of these clusters represent a unit that then has to intercluster with other clusters. And so this idea that we were looking at here of how does information flow between the clusters and how do the relationships connect between the clusters, is something that warrants attention. And it can be, okay, if we're trying to cluster out loud more loudly, then who are similar networks to our own, where we have credibility, where we have traction, where we can persuade each other, and how do we invite those closest to us to then become infectious agents of new social norms. So instead of a disease infector, a norm infector. Is that helpful, or is that enough? Or did you?
Yeah, I actually would like to speak to this as well. Karen O'Brien was one of my favorite speakers from the conference, because she really spoke to the fractal approach to transformation through scaling, and how the phenomenon can just occur in that organic, natural way of communities connecting with other communities. And Joe Brewer also spoke very much to the idea of bioregional and centers working together, and then his work of connecting then bioregions together to come together. And I saw that as this concept of the fractal organic development of change, which really is what we're talking about here this morning. This one slide, it's hard to catch it, but her other slide that I think you have, Michael, if you could go to the next one, you see this personal, political, and practical, and know her book, the one that shows her book. You may matter more than you think. Can you
It's
go?
not in here. Oh, you mean here?
I think it is that one. Okay, so when you look at the bottom picture there that looks like cells, that's really that personal, that's a repetition of that other model over and over and over again, and the way that works. And I know that there's a strong sensibility developing that fractal organic growth is occurring. And I just thought she brought it together in a really nice way. And that was a theme throughout the conference. So I just wanted to add that piece. But I really do think it makes sense that bioregional then working together, joining together to help create change is what is underway. Whether or not it'll be successful in time is another question.
Yeah, and I will also emphasize the fractal idea, because when we hear the word scale, especially in things like large things like poverty, climate, etc., we think in terms of expanding, making it bigger. Bigger is better. If you look at the analysis that climate action receives these days, it's almost always a linear extrapolation of how much effort is needed, how much money is needed, and so on. But nature, as well as human societies, are clustered, and fractal implementation aligns better with our natural clustering. than this idea of scale.
Mhm. Mhm.
One of the ways in which natural intelligence differs from human-designed intelligence systems is in engineering, we tend to do exactly that kind of. We can just grow these megaliths, right? These monster. And in natural systems, after things reach a certain critical mass, they tend to split off and then establish a signaling system between them. And there can be
Exactly.
signaling both between peers, and there can be signaling up and down the let's call it a vertical hierarchy, where the relationship is about one picking up longer landscapes, longer timelines, larger, so viewing a different panorama, and then synchronizing about this is the longer timeline, the shorter, and remaining in a signaling relationship that is about synchronizing the differences between what is being seen. And so hierarchy in nature is still mutualistic rather
Yeah.
than authoritative. And
Yes.
it's understanding how the information is being shared up and down to improve the capacity of each level to do what it's doing. And I know it's kind of a sidebar. It wasn't in the conference, but it's coming up for me as we're speaking about, with whom are we in these conversations, and how do we keep these conversations going so that we remain synchronized, or maybe synchronized is too big a word. We remain in a harmonious interacting. We continue to dance together.
Yeah, absolutely.
well-
So we come back to every time any discussion of nature and Wells regeneration, we come back to emphasis on relationality.
Mhm.
And I would go a step further and say not just that a relationship exists, but rather what is the quality of that relationship.
Mhm.
Now, in nature, we are interconnected. It's not that we can ever not be interconnected. We are always interconnected, but we can choose to ignore it. We can choose to deplete it.
Oh, I'm having trouble hearing you,
Me
Tanuja.
too. It all of a sudden
Yeah.
went bad.
I think you may have run out of battery.
Okay, I'll come back.
Okay.
Remark about quality, because one of the interesting things, and I think we should open it up for questions, for conversations, for reactions, but this idea of quality, sometimes we can get normative in a way that in natural systems, it turns out that if they're interacting, that is almost enough. That whether or not for example, whether the interaction is frictional or non-frictional, or it's about there being a signaling back and forth on a continuous basis, and so staying in relation as much as anything.
Could you take down the slides, Michael? That would be helpful. And then that gives us back our room, and we really want to hear from you all. And maybe Gil, or if you're done in the kitchen, you could tell us. Gil was also there. He might not be free yet. Any thoughts or reactions from anyone yet? I love the Charlie Foxtrot from Zen Benefiel. If is he still on? Yes. Hi. Yeah. The
I am here.
clusters do interesting things.
Don't they?
Yeah.
And even in that coming together, right? There's this perceived chaos in it that are really just patterns we don't understand yet. It's the subtle activity that we're attempting to get to really not think our way through it, but sense our way through, because it is natural.
Yes. Yes. That sense making. They talked about that as well. I think that's exactly what's going on. It's really how we all operate.
Absolutely. We are the earth, right? Every cell in our body is made from nutrients that came from the planet.
Mhm.
do we really recognize that? And by so doing, then make ourselves available to those further depths of subtle activity?
Yeah. 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 Lynn.
First, thank you very much for Michael, you did a great job and great pace as far as I'm concerned, like going through and just giving us just a sense of it. And I welcome any other ahas that anyone had, you know, like the things that they really were struck by. But my question is, I noticed in the overall, there was an emphasis on cities, municipalities. Could you just say more about that? Does that suggest anything to us around how we need to be, I guess, you know, concentrating on cities more, municipalities, just a little bit more on that? Thanks.
I'll offer a quick answer, but I don't think it's just that particular community has one of its claims to fame is that it innovated indicators for the world. They did some research a few years ago, adding to existing indicators for performance, this idea of thresholds and allocations. And so I know this is doing a little bit of a wonky dive, but basically that enables, and the way I like to talk about it is like if we're all using a watershed and I'm just reporting I used less than last year, then I can be looking good while still not really changing my behavior much, a little better than last year. By putting thresholds and common allocations, I can say out of the total, putting on a common denominator, all the water in the watershed, what is my percentage usage? All of a sudden, you begin to see relationality of usage. And so for every indicator, whether it's an ecological or a social indicator could be what level of collective bargaining is there in a company, what level of, what is the ratio of average employee wages to the CEO? Is it 20, which is a target, or is it 700 times, as happens in many companies? And so all of these allow for comparisons of collectives to be acting and self-organizing more accurately. So for this community, the idea of organizations can influence communities and communities can influence bioregions was kind of the sweet spot for it. And there are many of us here for whom that also applies. For others of us, it might be that as individuals, we can be changing our networks. And so we're just trying to kind of get the acquisition of the language and the ideas to get us juiced up to change wherever we are, you know, begin with whatever comes through you, because that's probably it. So anyone else want to add, please feel free.
Thank you.
Well, you know what you just said, Michael, whatever comes through you, that's what it is. And I think that really sort of weaving together Zen's comment and this concept that we are all sense making and feeling our way all the time, including in the whole Dunbar realm, right? Is like, who do I want to talk to? Who do I want to connect with? Who's connecting with me? What happenstance? It's this incredibly organic thing that's happening all the time that I think that getting in touch with, and maybe that's what meditation is trying to help us do, is put us more in touch with how we're feeling about things so we can respond in a more thoughtful way. David.
Oh yeah. No, I love the presentation, Michael, and Pam, I think you brought up one of the things I thought was that Michael normally emphasizes is the self-regeneration piece, right? So it's the me to me first. And I do think that, like meditation is a symptom of, having better capacity to do something in this world, right? So I like that. But this organizational thing is fascinating to me too. So Michael, one is I'd love to have you I'll just steal it out of this talk or I'll get you to redo it or something like that. But I mean, in some sense, you gave the mission for like regeneration pollination, right? The speed networking is supposed to create the thick networks. That's the point. And GRC, I think, was, David Hodgson's attempt to offload some of his networking responsibilities, right? So the kind of the motive, the head fake for GRC is we have lots of Zoom calls where we get to, enjoy being with each other, but we're creating connectivity in the processes. That's the outcome. And it does feel to me like the Dunbar's number analysis doesn't really fit what's going on here. And that's Mark, why I was trying to go through and get a better framing of it, Mark, because I don't think we're talking about strong relationships exactly. We're talking about flow or
Right.
nudging, or there's something else that's happening here, I think. And it probably isn't, like, because if you put some of this onto your LinkedIn and it reaches 1,000 people, that had an effect, I don't know what kind of effect, but there's another energy source going on out here, right? And so
it's that ongoing self-organization that is continuously occurring, and I think that's what we're starting to develop.
yeah, right. So there's some other, and that's why I was wondering about like brain cells or something. I mean, they don't have like just 150 friends they talk with, or somehow there's pulses. And this is the tipping point notion kind of, I think, breaks the Dunbar
I've been
concept,
told I
right?
don't have many cells.
But you've used they've died in valiant efforts, and that's the thing they've given themselves to all of us. But anyway, so I think that I'm finding that networking piece really, really interesting, and would love to explore more, because that's kind of where a bunch of the work I've been doing lives. And I just wanted to say one thing about Tanisha's comment about David Witzel, you are GRC kind of. I think we make that mistake a ton, and it really matters. So we blame companies, right, for things, and then we point at their CEOs or something, right? And when, I know, Gil, you must have this experience all the time. There's like all these people in a company, and they would like to be, environmentalists, but when they get to work, they don't behave that way. And there's something that happens to our human individual autonomy in the group, right? That changes the way we behave differently in different contexts, effectively, right? And so we should not call somebody their organization, or we should call them multiple organizations, or I don't know what the result of that is, but I am not GRC. I can make GRC do things within ranges. And I may have more kind of authority than other people do, but if I go very far, people just stop paying attention. So there's limits to
it's
it.
influence, right? I think that's part
We're
of
back to some kind of an influence thing, but it probably isn't. There's something important about the company framing, but we need to be careful about how we judge the levels of responsibility or something within that.
Sometimes we
Other
can only
approaches-
just plant seeds to ask questions to get that conversation evolving.
Yeah, influence. We're talking influence here. So Sarah, thank you for waiting.
Thank you. Maybe my question was, did you see at the conference also like concrete examples of how they managed to kind of scale link the experiment and relationship that they had, and on how it could, I mean, influence, for example, the way we set up our infrastructures, and then will support or not support new patterns of relationship. So really seeing, because this presentation is super interesting, but for me, for example, we don't talk much. It's about, like, for example, sometimes the blockage that can make you unable, like sometimes you have cultural blockage that block you from setting up new patterns of relationships. So yeah, curious about like if you could discuss about like a new concrete example at a further scale.
I think we start that desire to wish for something concrete is really an interesting one. I am going to share my screen just very briefly here, because Joe Brewer had a slide that I took a picture of that I think gets as close to concrete as is reasonable. And he is talking about starting all of these funding ecosystems around the world, and then he's bringing them together to talk to each other. And so I think that as far as concrete goes, it's something that really is a little mushier than that as what we're talking about. But I thought this was an interesting thing, a planetary network of bioregional funding ecosystems. And so if that scratches the itch a little bit on how this is organically growing, I can share that from the conference.
Okay, thanks. And then I guess there would be many discussions about the way you structure movement and infra for these bioregions.
And that brings me to my very favorite speaker, who was Sahana, and I don't want to butcher her last name. Tanuja, what was her last name? I'll let you butcher it.
Okay. So Sahana Chattopadhyay. I can put it in the
Put it in the chat. But she
I'll do
talked
that.
about a pluriverse instead of a universe, that the concept of a universe is colonialist and hegemonic, and there's one thing that's right, and where a pluriverse understands that there are worlds within worlds interrelated to worlds, and that we actually live in a pluriverse. And to me, that was the take-home message of the entire conference, is just rethinking for me and really recognizing how many different ways there are to do this.
And we're happy to say that Sahana is a member of the GRC, and she has agreed to present next week at this session.
Yeah, so we're going to ask her on. It's like a dream come true for me. She was so awesome. Do not miss that Regen Econ morning for sure. She just really nailed it, in my humble opinion. Fan, good morning. Nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, thank you so much. There's a lot to think about, and especially I really like, the difference between the scale and, cluster, fractal development. So I'm gonna definitely meditate on that. So my inquiry is really about, we talked multiple times about relationship, like, do we have a method to explore like relationship, and especially those notice, like what kind of, the relation dynamics that we pretend that doesn't exist, like either traumas, cultural factors, and, like the trust issues, and all this sense. The reason I'm asking is really I've been thinking, while you're presenting, Mike, like, Michael, like, what kind of, attunement and discernment, at the individual level, I need to exercise, to collaborate with a group of people, and then how a group as a collective develop that, attunement and discernment capacity to collaborate with another group in the network, basis. And to me, I know sometimes relationship, like those invisible sense, it's very hard to have some solid, like a structure, or it's just, I'm kind of yearning to learn more. Maybe I'll do my own literature research that, how we can conceptualize, this relational field that help us, that create a environment that conducive to, human collaboration. So at least, that's something inspired me to look into from today's talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. A lot to meditate on. Dan, good morning.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here and to see some long-time old friends. I'm not sure if this how relevant this is since I'm new to this call, but it strikes me that the kind of stuff that Stephen Strogatz talks about with who's an expert in how fireflies synchronize is relevant. It seems we were talking about we have our own small groups, and so in the scheme of things, it's a very large random universe. And if you want to get your ideas or ideas to propagate, how does that happen to people who you're not connected with? And then we talked about how we're sort of tightly and highly clustered in our own small groups. To convince our own small groups, there's this sort of phase transition point where if a third of the group says, yes, this is a good thing to do, then other people start believing it more and more. How does that happen with other people you're not connected to? He would say that one way to do it is you find the super connectors between your small world network and other small world networks. And it looks to me like that's what Joe Brewer is trying to do across bioregional financing. It's not necessarily that they're all going to do the same thing, but if you connect them, then the ideas have got a greater propensity to spread from one to another.
Yeah, agreed, Dan. We talk about diversity all the time. And but the way we talk about it isn't what you have described, and it isn't what the way nature works. It's much, nature is never just one thing in one place. That one thing, if you really hone in on it, is multiple things working together so that the one thing emerges from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and multiple things emerge from it, actually. So there, you know, this is really, it's mind-blowing when you really start to think what does interconnection mean, and it strikes me, Dan, in what you're sharing, that I wonder how much influence is going on between LinkedIn and GRC and R3.0 and Joe Brewer and all of these things, now that we have this really global capability to be gathering together with people all around the world. So, you know, Sarah is in France and she's going to get off this call and she's going to go talk to people really halfway around the world. And you may as well be halfway around the world from where I am in San Francisco, Dan. And these, all of this is happening all the time, and all of these influences are just happening and flowing, and energy's flowing all around. But you mentioned something about synchronizing, and the beginning to synchronize is, I think, what I want to just keep alive in the conversation. Right. So all of this cool stuff and moving is occurring all the time, and I really trust that. But the synchronizing of coherent concepts moving forward is certainly our attempt here. My attempt with regenerative economics is to create a space where a little bit of synchronizing can start to take hold, and just plug in to the bigger energy flows. Lynn.
That reminds me of an idea I had. One of you on this call would know, like, what happens if all the networks, like, took a month of January is context-based sustainability, February is emergence, you know, March is another theme, and that we all kind of like contributed on a theme across, you know, different channels, but kind of created a synchronous kind of online awareness of different concepts we think are important.
Yeah. And, you know, Gil, I think synchronizing leads to coherence and coordination. It's not an either or. I think they're all in there.
It's one way. It's not the only way.
Yes, correct. Correct.
Singing together can create coherence. Like I'm extremely sensitive to crowds, right? So it's really hard. I go to church regularly. There's like 200 people there. And when there's breakouts or when everyone's sort of forming together, everyone's talking to each other separately, right? And it's a cacophony of sound, right? And it's literally painful to my ears. And yeah, it's a little bit loud. It's not that loud, but it's the randomness of it, of all that energy separately going in conversation. But once they get together and they start singing, I'm perfectly fine. Everyone's focused. They stop chattering. It's just as loud, if not more loud. And yet I'm completely relaxed. Everything is wonderful. All that energy just aligns and it stops bothering me and I'm fine. So I have to step out when they do like quote unquote fellowship breaks. I'm like, I'm gone. I can't handle that. So there's something about that separateness and that togetherness that music allows people to be together, both in their spirits and their minds, and it quiets their mind. So there's something going on there that maybe we need to be more orchestrated and like singing symphonies and stuff like that. Every kind of political movement, they always have songs, right? I mean, look at the Chinese Revolution, right? Filled with singing and chants and slogans and all kinds of things to unify the hearts and the minds. Now, I'm not sure I value what they value in that, but it works.
Could I finish what I was saying? Dennis hopped in while I was still speaking. And
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it was a good comment, but I just want to continue on the pushback on synchronization. This is unformed and probably a little dangerous, but it struck me in this call and some of our previous calls that there's something peculiar in the room with us. So not anybody on screen, but I'm feeling the presence of the mechanistic worldview in our conversation. We are looking for mechanisms. We're looking for protocols and procedures, and if you do this, then this will happen. We're inescapable. We can't avoid this. We've grown up in this for hundreds of years, but we are looking at this regenerative, emergent, pluralistic, poly-networked, emergent world through a mechanistic frame. And I'm saying this not as a complaint, but just an observation that's come to me in the last few weeks in a lot of conversations I'm in. And I find it puzzling and fascinating. And it's a thread that I'm going to be playing with some more. So just wanted to share that. I don't know if that resonates for anybody else.
Well,
I understand.
Sensitivity, it's understandable that there would be tinges. Tanuja, yes.
More than tinges, as I'm all you guys know, I'm an electrical engineer by education. If anything has changed, it's 10%, because that training, the framework, dismantling it can only be done if there is an alternate framework. And we're trying to build an alternate framework. So Gil, any pointers you may have to gradually reduce the mechanistic side and move it towards a more
I think the first thing is just for us to notice it. Is to notice when it shows up. It's not a bad thing. Mechanistic has its value. We wouldn't be here doing this conversation without mechanistic. We wouldn't be able to fly and see each other, et cetera. So it's not to toss that out, but just notice where the worlds blend and overlap, and what is that? How does that color and perhaps limit where we can go in the conversation about regeneration?
Sarah, please.
Thank you for letting me pop in here ahead of you or behind you or something. And not to be rude, I'm going to have to leave in a minute for another call. So thank you, everybody. Keep going.
For me, I thought you were doing a brilliant work at opening a space where we can meet a pluriverse of views on the subject. I mean, because synchronizing would be all adjusting to the same level. For me, like I'm embedded in the French ecosystem. So it's more like the main framework of our state is not actually completely mechanistic. It's more like social Catholic dating, and so it's very interesting to see from the different views. And so I really think GRC is an interesting place to have different worlds meet each other. Although there is a lot of people coming from rather Western English-speaking countries. And so, yeah, it was just to to articulate that, and just to say also, like, I've been looking for a so we've been setting up a learning cohort in France for the financial sector on how to go to a regenerative economy, and I've been struggling to find economists and people applying at financial level the theories to show a different way to go, for showing it to the French central bank, to a local institutional investor. And I mean, I think GRC also can, and this place can maybe play a role also in starting to gather this crowd. So thank you.
Thank you. Dan.
Just a quick last comment. Perhaps it's not mechanistic, but a little reductionist. We're creating a model in our minds, and we're trying to simplify things. And but we're working in a complex, nonlinear dynamic system. And in the end, we're all just a whole bunch of bacteria and funguses doing our own things, and trying to figure out how come those other bacteria on the other side of the planet aren't doing the same things as us.
Well, that's why I brought in the pluriverse for sure. But I think that we have, man, this hour flew by, absolutely flew by. It was just terrific. So much good stuff, and really great stuff here. Yes, thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming this morning. Michael, your hand kept going up and then you let folks go in front. Do you want to have a final word here?
Just thank you.
Oh, yeah.
And talk to others. Whatever's in your mind, talk to others. Build the whatever.
Keep on
the conversation.
spreading.
Yep.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
We didn't get to hear whether Tanuja was putting her retirement funds into shorting the collapse.
Oh gosh.
Oh, Tanuja.